So just post our discussion of Francis Bacon, some concluding words about him. Um, he quotes Aristotle. He probably did not yet have Aristotle translated because his version of Aristotle is not our version. In fact, Bacon himself seems much closer to Aristotle than the Aristotle that he condemns and criticizes. You should know that Aristotle is kind of a name for all of medieval philosophy. So Aristotle gets invoked, even though he's not read because he's not yet in translation, and he stands in for something else. We know this not to be true of Aristotle because we've read his Poetics, and we've learned we've learned methodologies of writing from Aristotle, and we'll see that this is a misrepresentation of Aristotle, yet it's nonetheless interesting in relationship to Bacon and what he's doing. So Bacon says of Aristotle, for he had come to his conclusion before. He did not consult experience as he should have done in order to the framing of his decisions and his axioms. Remember, those axioms are things that are already agreed upon, not contested, the things from which we build other things upon. But having first determined the question according to his will, he then resorts to experience. This frankly sounds like a lot of bad papers that I've read, none of them by you, of course, but having first determined the question according to his will, first he comes up with his thesis statement, and then he resorts to experience to find as much evidence as he can in order to support it. And bending her into conformity with his placets, whatever that is, leads her about like a captive in procession, so that even on this count, he is more guilty than his modern followers, the schoolmen who have abandoned experience altogether. The schoolmen are the philosophers of the Middle Ages, who are in the realm of abstraction and ideas. Aristotle is even worse than them, because he has first come up with that thesis sentence. I'm sorry that this is my continuing, it's very early in the morning here, my continuing battle against the thesis sentence, not because it's a bad thing, and we should have a thesis sentence or a thesis series of sentences or a thesis paragraph, but because bad writing, and this is really what Bacon is criticizing in Aristotle, bad writing and bad thinking, is you start with your axiom, and then you find your evidence, and even if it doesn't fit, you lead her or them or those pieces of evidence like a captive in a procession. We're all familiar with this. We have a really, really brilliant idea, and we love the idea so much that even if the evidence that we find in the work about which we're writing doesn't fit exactly, we smash it in, or we ignore evidence that doesn't fit that thesis. A thesis should always be a hypothesis. And Bacon's idea of experimentation, which is very similar to our idea of writing, is that you do start with some kind of hypothesis, but that hypothesis will always change in relationship to the evidence that you bring. So when you're writing a paper, you need a hypothesis because that's how the mind works. You need a generalization. I'm not sure if Bacon would put it this way. You need a generalization. And as you find evidence, that generalization must change. What Bacon here is saying about Aristotle, and what he's saying about earlier ways of thinking, the thinking of the Middle Ages, is that people start with their conclusions, they start with their axioms, they start with that first part of a syllogism, Socrates, all men are mortal. That's one that's obvious and probably not contestable, but there are other axioms that are contestable. People start with those axioms without interrogating them, without looking into them, without bringing further evidence in order to understand them better, maybe to qualify them. And starting with those axioms, they simply end with such axioms. And Bacon says, and we talked about this in class, here therefore is the first distemper of learning, When men study words and not matter, words are but the images of matter, and except they have life of reason and invention. Reason and invention, I love that. To fall in love with them is to fall in love with the picture. If you just fall in love with the words themselves, and Bacon is really critiquing a generation of people, not a generation, hundreds of years of people from his point of view, and Bacon thinks of himself as a modern. Um, the hundreds of years of thought has been dominated by words, and to fall in love with them is to fall in love with the picture. This is again a Baconian appropriation of the Platonic hierarchy. Words still don't do well, as they didn't do well in Plato, but for Bacon, the way that words, and they do come back in Bacon, the way that words do get their power and strength is through reason and invention. Invention is the important word here, the ability to change, the ability to innovate, the ability to take into account the world and to understand it. Just so we can bring it home and think about this in relationship to our primary concern, that is the writing of poetry during our period. Here is Bacon speaking explicitly. Well, he's using language that we're familiar with of fiction and, well, we talked about artifice, but fiction, artifice, imagination, and magic. So here's Bacon. So they who are carried away by insane and uncontrollable passions. Let's line up all the things that Bacon finds bad. So they who are carried away by insane and uncontrollable passions after things which they only fancy they see through the clouds and vapors of imagination, shall in place of works, again, the Protestant emphasis on activity, the 17th century emphasis on activity, shall in place of works beget nothing else but empty hopes and hideous and monstrous specters. Monster shadows. But this popular and degenerate magic lays the understanding asleep by signing of specific properties and hidden virtues sent as from heaven and only to be learned from the whispers of tradition, which makes men no longer alive and awake for the pursuit and inquiry of real causes, but to rest content with these slothful and credulous opinions. And then it insinuates innumerable fictions pleasant to the mind, and such as one would most desire, like so many dreams. Wow, he really pours it on here. What are the things that are in opposition to the kinds of truth that he's pursuing? Passion, imagination, hideous monstrosities, slothful and credulous opinions. Again, there's that Platonic resonance. There's knowledge on the one hand and opinions on the other, and fictions which are pleasant to the mind, delightful, but also dreamlike. Wow. So you really see here Bacon is laying it on thick. He is not going to be a big advocate of poetry. He's not going to be one of the people that Ben Jonson or any other poet is going to look to as a possible patron. We see here in Bacon, and this is really important in our period, and it's important for us today as well, because we still live with this Baconian separation. There is truth, which he doesn't mention here, but he talks about the inquiry into real causes. And on the opposite side of that, on the opposite side of the world of experimentation, science, and truth, is passion, imagination, delight. Remember, to teach and delight, not for Bacon, desire, dreams, and fictions. Pretty hardcore against any conception of poetry. Let's just read one more passage from Bacon. I find not any science that doth properly or fitly pertain to the imagination. And so we learn. And again, it is no small dominion which imagination holds in persuasions that are wrought by eloquence. So here's an attack on two things, not only imagination, but imagination and rhetoric, eloquence. For when by arts of speech men's minds are soothed, inflamed, here's the attack on emotion, and carried hither and thither. It is all done by stimulating the imagination till it becomes ungovernable, and not only sets reason at naught, there's the word, but offers violence to it, partly by blinding it, partly by incensing it, by raising it up, by instigating it, inciting it. So here in Bacon's ideal world, I didn't mention that he writes his own utopia, a utopia as we've spoken of before. Plato's Republic is a utopia. Thomas More, who's a 16th century writer in English, writes a utopia. It's called Utopia. Utopia in Greek is a no place. Um, Bacon writes his own utopia, and in his utopia, what do people do? Everybody does experiments. They all perform the activity of experimentation, and through that activity of experimentation, they put the mind to the activity that suits most to reason and truth, and we see imagination getting pushed to the side. What is a poet to do?